we'll be covering the fundamentals of Zoho CRM APIs. Now, this is going to be the agenda for tonight. First, we'll go with a brief introduction of what an API is, followed by what Zoho CRM APIs are, and then an introduction to the different categories of Zoho CRM APIs, how authorization is handled for the APIs, and what are the different CRUD operations that are supported through our APIs. And then the end session will be for Q&A. So the most basic question, what is an API? API is an acronym that stands for Application Programming Interface. An API allows two applications to talk to each other. Now, let me just explain this with an example. We all, have come across a lot of e-commerce websites. Many of us have used them. So either be it from a mobile or, on a browser. So we just go to the e-commerce website and then we look for, something. Let's say I'm going to look for a table. So I just go there, I type in my search term, and then I see, a million products related to a table or share, maybe sometimes. So what happens in the background? When I, type my search term, the request is passed from the client, that is the browser, either on your, laptop or any other device or a mobile device. The request is passed on to the e-commerce website's server. And then based on the type of request that you have, data is fetched from the database and then a response is rendered. So here we are hitting some endpoint. Let's say I'm looking for a table, then there could be, a table in the database itself that says, that holds all information about table. So we are hitting this endpoint. This is called an API. So this is how two applications that are there on different, parts of the world communicate with each other. So we have different types of APIs like SOAP, RPC, and Zoho CRM APIs follow the REST concept. So what are Zoho CRM APIs? So we talked about, the e-commerce website where how, our request is processed and a response is rendered. Similarly, when you want to, access data that is stored in Zoho CRM, we have APIs specifically for that. So these are called Zoho CRM APIs. So these APIs allow developers to connect Zoho CRM data very easily. Now, why do you have to use Zoho CRM API? Now, API, it is highly scalable, very flexible. The speed is great. So when you use, Zoho CRM APIs, you're able to automate your business with workflows. You can integrate easily with other applications. You can customize your CRM very easily. And in the end, it all boils down to managing customer relationships effectively. Now, the different categories of Zoho CRM APIs. So we have records, we have metadata, bulk, composite, query, and notification APIs. Now, why do we have these categories? So in Zoho CRM, you can perform a lot of operations. You can perform operations on the records. You can do, bulk operations. You might want to, query for certain records using certain operators on certain fields. You might want to get notified on, data changes that happen in CRM. So based on the use case and based on what the APIs do, we've categorized them into all these categories. So let us just see what each of them means. So records API. As you all know, in a table, data is stored in the form of records. So this is my CRM. This is my leads module. We have in our CRM UI, we have leads, contacts, accounts, deals, tasks. We have different modules. And then in each of these modules, we have large set of data. So each data is called a record. So when we do manipulations on these records, we use the records APIs. So the operations that we allow through records API are, you can create records, you can read records, you can update records, you can delete records, you can mass update records, and so on. So this is all about the records API. Coming to metadata API. So I talked about, different modules that are there, leads, accounts, deals, contacts, etc. in CRM. So what is metadata? Metadata is data about data. For example, let's just say I want to insert a lead, record in the leads module. So for that, I need to know the different fields that are there in the leads module. And then I need to know the data type of each of these fields, the layouts that are there, the related lists that are there, the custom views that are there. So how do I get this data? So this is when I use the metadata APIs. So these APIs essentially are very useful when we're performing data validation, and they also help us understand CRM's underlying data module, like the different modules, the different fields in the modules, the data types, the relationship between multiple modules, the related lists, custom views, and so on. Coming to bulk APIs. Now we talked about record APIs. So record APIs allow you to get 200 records per API call or insert 100 records per API call. Now let's say you want to import data from another third-party application into CRM, or you want to export your CRM data to another application. Then here we are looking at potentially, hundreds of thousands of records. So records API cannot be used. So in this case, you'll be using the bulk APIs. So when you're dealing with a large volume of data, you use bulk APIs. So because we are dealing with a large volume of data, this API is an asynchronous API. By asynchronous, we mean the response of this API is not available immediately. So what happens is when you make this bulk API call, it schedules a job in the background. So essentially, when you're making a bulk API call, you typically give a callback URL. This is because it schedules a job, you can poll to the callback URL and check for the status of this API job. So the different bulk APIs that we have are bulk read, bulk write, and data backup. So bulk read is essentially for exporting records from CRM. Bulk write is importing records from another application into Zoho CRM. And data backup is for you to back up your CRM data, schedule it, and it is available. The result is available as a CSV file for you to download later. Now coming to composite API. So let's say we talked about inserting a record, or reading, or updating a record. So let me just say I have a use case where I have to make API calls to multiple modules. Let's say I want to create a lead, and as soon as the lead is created, I want to attach a note to that lead. So in this case, I'll have to make two API calls. One is to the leads module, and the other one is to the notes module. So this is where composite API can be really helpful, because composite API allows us to combine up to 5 API requests in a single API call. And the biggest advantage is that you can make API calls to different modules in a single request. So this is very useful, when you have dependent API calls. Like I said, you have, you want to insert a lead, and then you want to attach a note to the inserted lead. So you use composite API. And another advantage of using composite API is that it reduces the round trip time. By round trip time, I mean the time it takes for the request to reach the server and then bring back a response. So let's say you are making 2 API calls, then you'll have to wait for the response for creating a lead, and then again wait for the response of adding a note. So when you combine these 2 API calls in a composite request, you'll just have to wait for the response of 1 API call. And then another big plus of using a composite API is that it allows for rollback. So by rollback, I mean when one of the requests fail. In composite API, we have different, like I said, you can make multiple API calls. So each of these API calls are considered sub-requests. So if one of the sub-requests fail, you can choose to roll back the entire operation. For example, I create a lead and I get an error while adding a note. Then if I've given rollback, if I want to perform a rollback, then the lead will also be not created. So this is the advantage of using composite API. See, this is how the input for the composite API looks like. So under composite requests, you have one sub request to insert a lead, and then you have another sub request to insert a note to the created lead. Coming to query API. So many of us have a great experience with SQL's select query. So query API also uses the syntax is similar to SQL's select query, and this uses something called the CRM object query language. So this is, as you can see, it is very, very similar to SQL's select query. So the advantage of query API is that it supports a wide range of operators, a wide range of comparators, so that you can fetch records from from different modules over different fields. So in this select query, you can see it's very, very similar to SQL's select query. So here in the select query, I'm selecting last name, lead source, and languages known from the context module. And in the where clause, I have a set of conditions. So because this API allows for a lot of comparators and operators. So use cases are just endless for using query API. Coming to notification APIs. So we all want to know, we all want to stay apprised of what's happening with our CRM data. So notification APIs are very useful when you want to know what when something changes in your CRM data. So notification APIs allow you to listen to CRM data changes in near real time. So what happens in notification APIs is that you create a channel for specific action. For example, you create a channel to be notified when a lead is created or an account is deleted. So when you create a channel, you can listen through the channel when these events occur. So let's say I have created a channel through the notification API to notify me when contact is deleted. So when it happens, I get a notification. So this is very useful because we know what exactly is happening with our data. So this covers the different categories of APIs we have in Zoho CRM. Authorization. So we talked about making API calls, inserting a record, making a bulk API call, getting notified through notification APIs. So how is authorization handled? So let's say when you want to use an application, you simply just cannot download the application or go to the application's homepage and start using it. Most of the applications want you to sign up. Similarly, even APIs, they need to be authorized. So we use something called the OAuth 2.0 protocol. So OAuth stands for Open Authorization. It is an industry standard protocol that is very widely used. So Zoho CRM APIs also use the OAuth 2.0 protocol for authentication. Now, why we use OAuth 2.0? So the biggest advantage of using OAuth 2.0 is that you don't have to store users' credentials. Let's say I'm signing up to some app, which means my credentials are stored somewhere. So in OAuth 2.0, you don't have to, there is no need for the application to store users' credentials. It works on delegated access, which means, let's say I am trying to use an app, and then instead of signing up to the app, I sign in with Google or log in with Zoho. So in this case, I am allowing the application access my data on behalf of me, which means I don't have to directly give my credentials. I give the application the access to use my data. So this is what OAuth 2.0 is. And another advantage of OAuth 2.0 is it is very secure because there are no tokens that are visible on the UI. And we have something called scoped access, where let's say an application has access to only access your data related to modules, which means it can only read your data in Zoho CRM. Then with that access token or with that token, the application will only be able to read your data and nothing else. So we have scoped access, which increases the security, and these access tokens expire after 1 hour, which means if you've allowed access to the application to read your data, and this access token is only valid for 1 hour, which means the application can access your data for only 1 hour. So let's say even if there is a security breach, so when there is a security breach, because the access tokens expire in 1 hour, after that security breach is contained. Now let's just see OAuth 2.0 with an example. Now I have created an app called Food Genie, which is a food delivery app, and I'm running a campaign that says if you allow me access to your contacts, you'll get 20% off on your first order. So I have my application, and my application also has the sign in with Google button. So my application doesn't require the users to sign up to my application. Instead, they can simply sign in with their Google credentials. So what happens is you use my application. Now you just sign in with Google. When you do that, the application calls Google. So what happens is you immediately see, Google's login screen, which means the application takes you to Google's login screen so that you can give your credentials. So what happens is you give your credentials, and then Google verifies the credentials, and Google also asks you that this application tries to access your contacts, do you allow or not? So you give yes or no. So when you give yes, Google returns a grant token to the application, which means Google returns a grant token to my application. So when I'm making, when I call Google, I tell Google that I want to be able to read this user's Google contacts. So what happens is the scope is defined here, which is nothing but reading the this user's Google contacts. So what happens is Google, because it has verified my identity and I have given access to Food Genie to access my contacts, Google returns a grant token. So this grant token is also called as an authorization code, and it is more like an OTP. So once Google returns a grant token, this application calls Google's Authentication API. So it says, okay, this is Food Genie app, and I have the grant token. So can you please give me access token so that I can access this user's contacts stored in Google. So what happens is, after verifying the scope and the grant token, Google returns an access token. So this access token is valid for an hour. So what happens is, now Food Genie, it gives this access token and makes an API call to Google to request contacts. So once the access token is accepted, Google gives access to Food Genie to access my contacts. So all this happens, in the background in an instant. All you'll be seeing is, the Food Genie app or the sign-in app. So all this happens in an instant. So this is essentially the OAuth 2.0 protocol. As you can see, I have not signed up to Food Genie, and Food Genie doesn't have to store my credentials anywhere. It's all a token-based system, so it is very, very secure. Let's say I also, revoke access. So many of us do that, right? Let's say by mistake, we would have allowed access to our photos to some app. And after some time, we realize that, this app need not be accessing my photos. So we just go and remove permission. Similarly, when you don't want your this application to access, you can always revoke the tokens, which means once the tokens are revoked, the application will no longer be able to access the data. So this is the OAuth 2.0 flow. Now, we told about Food Genie app being making Food Genie app making an API call to Google and all that. So how does it happen? So let's just switch to Zoho CRM context here. So I have developed an application that wants to use data stored in Zoho CRM. So what I have to do is I have to register my application as a client in Zoho. So let's just see how it happens. So you have to go to Zoho's API console at apiconsole.zoho.com. This is the API console. So apiconsole.zoho.com. So I have already created a few clients here. So when you want to try to create add a client, so you'll have to know what client type you'll have to choose. So this is based on the kind of application that you are developing. You could develop a client-based application, a server-based app, a mobile-based app, a non-browser app, or it could be a self-client. So let's just see what each of these mean. So client-based application. Let's say you have an application that runs exclusively on a browser and it doesn't have a web server. So if you are developing such an app, then client-based application is what we'll choose here. Now coming to server-based applications. So server-based applications, as the name suggests, it is built to run on a dedicated HTTP server. So like I said, we just talked about the Food Genie app, right? So here, there will be many users who will be using your application. So similarly, in Zoho CRM context, let's say your application has to access data of multiple users across multiple orgs in Zoho CRM. In such a case, you'll be choosing this server-based application. And your application will obviously have a UI. And your application interface will also have a login with Zoho button where the OAuth 2.0 protocol can be followed. Next is mobile-based applications. As the name suggests, you are developing an application exclusively for a smartphone or a tablet. And then non-browser applications. These days we have, most of us have a smart TV at home. So the applications that are designed for smart TVs or printers, so such kind of applications should use the non-browser application client type. Next is the self-client. So in self-client, let's say your application predominantly just performs a back-end job, like a data sync at the end of the day. So in such case, you don't need access to use multiple users' data. You will be the sole user of your application. In that case, you can choose self-client. So like I said, you register your client at Zoho Developer Console, and then you choose your client type. Like I said, self-client, which is for standalone applications that perform data sync or typically any kind of backend job, and you're the only user of the application. So you should choose self-client. And server-based application, like I said, it runs on a dedicated HTTP server, and you want to access data of multiple CRM users across multiple orgs, and your application will typically have a login with Zoho button. and then we discuss the other client types. Now, let me just try and create a server-based application here. So here I have my client type, which is server-based, and then I give a client name. And then you give the homepage URL. So homepage URL is your application's homepage URL. When I talked about the Food Genie app, right? So it is going to be your Food Genie app's homepage URL. And then authorized redirect URI. By redirect URI, I mean, let's say, let's just consider the Food Genie example again. So users, sign in with, they click the login with Zoho, login with Google button, and then your application redirects them to Google's sign-in page. Once the users sign in and verify the credentials and give your app the consent, then Google redirects the user back to your application. So where you want the users to be redirected is where you'll be. So this is also going to be another Food Genie's app URL, but it could be more specific to where you want the users to come back to. So when I create this, so you can see I've created a client already. So this is again a server-based client. So I have given a homepage URL, and this is my redirect URL. So as you can see, you will see a client ID and a client secret here. So this client ID and client secret is what identifies your application when you're trying to make calls to Zoho. So this is more like your username and password. So client ID and client secret must be kept, must be stored very securely, because once these are exposed, then the chances of data breach are very high. So we recommend that you store them very securely. So once your client ID, this is your client ID and client secret. So this is what you'll be using to make API calls to Zoho. So we'll see that in a bit. Generating tokens. So when I explained the OAuth 2.0 flow, I talked about the application receiving a grant token from Google, and then your application giving this grant token in exchange for access and refresh tokens. So let us just see what these mean. So grant token, like I said, you just when the user clicks login with Google, so your application redirects them to Google's sign-in page. And then when so when this is happening, what your application should essentially have the logic to open Google's sign-in page, which is essentially an API call. So your application will have the logic to open Google's login page where the users can give their credentials. So what you'll do is you'll be sending your client ID, and you'll be telling Google that this is my client ID. I've registered with you. So I am trying to use this user's contacts stored in your database. So what happens is Google will verify your client ID, client secret, and then it will also verify the scope. Like I said, the application tells that it wants to only read contacts from Google. So it will also check for the scope there. So once that scope is there and everything is done, so Google will give you a grant token, which means, okay, you are granted access. The resource owner, which is nothing but the user, has given you access, your application, the permission to get Google contacts. So what happens is it returns a grant token. So this is valid only for 10 minutes. So your application will now again make another API call to Google's authentication API. So what happens is you'll again send your client ID, and instead of sending your secret or scope, you'll be sending this grant token. So this essentially means the user has authenticated themselves, and that the user has given your app the access or the permission to access Google Contacts. So in return for grant token, you will be requesting for an access token. So Google verifies your grant token, and then it gives you an access and a refresh token. So with this access token, you will be making API calls to access Google's contacts. So in every API call that you make, you'll be attaching this access token as a bearer token. So this access token is valid for only 1 hour. So let's just say for 1 hour your application has had access to Google's contacts. So what happens after the 1 hour? So after 1 hour, this access token will no longer be valid, and you will not be able to make API calls to access contacts. So what happens is, again, you don't have to go through this flow of generating a grant token and then generating an access token all over again. So when you make the first API call to generate an access token, you will also get a refresh token in the response. So what do you do with this refresh token? So this refresh token is what you'll use to generate more access tokens. So using this refresh token, you can generate more access tokens and keep continuing with your API calls. So this access token is valid for an hour, and the refresh token is valid until it is removed. So I'll just demonstrate how to generate tokens. So let's just go for self-client. Like I said, in self-client, I mean, in any client type, you'll have to give the scope, which determines the level of access your application has to users' data. So here, let's say if you want your application to have access to only Zoho CRM's leads, and it wants to only read leads. So your scope would be something like Zoho CRM, which is the service name, leads is the module name, and this is going to be the operation type. So the different operation types are read, update, create, write, delete, or all. So all means your application has access to perform all kinds of operations on Zoho CRM data. So for simplicity's sake, I'm giving the scopes that I require. So I want to access all settings. I want to access users data. I want my app to have access to org data, and I want my application to have access to all module data. So these are my scopes, and I have to choose the duration of the access token here. Sorry, the grant token here. So the maximum is 10 minutes. So I'm giving 10 minutes, and I'm giving a brief description of the scope here. So when I give create, so I have given my scope, and now we have different environments in CRM. We have different orgs in CRM. So you need to choose the specific org that you want access to. So here I'm choosing this org, and then when I create, I get my grant token. So I'm copying this, and now I'm here in Postman. So as many of you know, Postman is an application that allows you to test different requests, HTTP requests. So in our documentation, we have a page called API collection, where in Postman we have our collection hosted here. So when you simply search for Zoho CRM developers, you can see our workspace. So when you go here and poke our collection, you will get all these folders. So these are boilerplate requests. So everything is already there with placeholders. All you have to do is you just have to replace the values for the different keys. So here in OAuth, I have to generate my access token here. So I have given my client ID, I have given my client secret here, and I have to give my grant token here. And the grant type is authorization code, because I have given authorization code in exchange for an access and a refresh token. So this is a post request. So now I'll make a post. I have my response where it has an access token, a refresh token, and it displays the scope, which means my application has access to all these modules or all these data in Zoho CRM. And then API domain. So we have users in different parts of the world. So we have users in different data centers. So let's say if a user is in the US, then their data center would predominantly be the US. So to access data that is there in that data center, you'll have to make API calls to that server. So you need a domain specific URL. So this is the API domain, which is the domain specific URL. So for this user, the data center is in the US. So the API domain will be www.zohoapis.com. For example, if let's say the user is in Australia, then this would be www.zohoapis.au. Similarly, for different data centers, this API domain URL will be different. So when you're making API calls, you have to make API calls to this domain. Now, token type, it's a bearer token. In OAuth 2.0 terms, bearer token essentially means an access token. And then expiry type. This expires in 3,600 seconds, which is nothing but 60 minutes an hour. So this access token is valid for 1 hour. Now, coming to, this is about self-client, pretty straightforward because I am the only user. Now coming to, a server-based application where we have, different users. So everything happens on the UI here. So to make, your application, essentially, it has the login with Zoho button. And then when the user clicks login with Google or login with Zoho button, your application should take them to that sign-in screen. So for Zoho, so here, this is our help doc. So for web-based application, which is nothing but the redirection flow. We call it the redirection flow because the users are redirected back to your application. So this is why we call it the redirection flow. And this is a web-based application. So like I said, the user clicks with login with Zoho button. And then as you see here, the application redirects the users to accounts.zoho.com. So this is the Zoho's sign-in page. So your application should essentially redirect your application should make this call. So once this page is displayed in the URL, you can see, I'll just show it to you. So for you to make this API call, you need to access this domain, the accounts URL of Zoho CRM, and then you're trying the authorization APIs. So here authorization, and you have to give the scope, which means what data of Zoho CRM user will your application be accessing. So here you have to give your scope and you have to give your client ID here. So when you give your client ID, Zoho will be able to match. And then response type will be code, which means I'm requesting for a grant token or authorization code. And then the access type will be offline or online. Right now, our API support only offline. So the value for this will be offline. And redirect URI. Like I said, redirect URI is where you want the users to be redirected to after they sign in with Zoho. So you have to make this API call. So here you have to give your scope. This is the client ID. So what happens on the browser is something like this. So when users, give sign in with Zoho, your application makes this call. So here I have given my client ID, I have given scopes here, and then I have given my redirect URI. So when I make this call, again, the users see this screen where they choose the org from which they want data access. So I'm choosing my org here, and as you can see, this is the consent screen which says this application would like to access following information in Zoho CRM about you. So these are the list of scopes which I had given. Now upon clicking accept, it redirects me to www.zoho.com. This is what I had given here. So when it redirects, there is a parameter here called code. So this is what holds the authorization code or the grant token. So what I have to do is your application should have the logic to parse this and store this authorization code to generate access and refresh tokens. You can also see you have the account server, and you see the parameter here called location. So location equal to US. This means this user's data is essentially in the US domain. For users in Canada or Japan or China, the location varies. So this is how you find out your location. Now that I have my grant token, now the users are also redirected back to my application. And now what I have to do is I have to store this grant token and then make API calls to generate access tokens. So this is my client, and then I'm trying to generate access tokens for this. As you can see, I have my client ID, client secret, and since this is the redirection flow, I have to pass the redirect URI as well. And then here I will paste my code that I just generated. And again, the grant type is going to be authorization code. You can see I have my access token, refresh token. These were the scopes that I had provided. My API domain, which is again zohoapis.com. My token type, which is a bearer token, and then the expiry type, which is 3600 seconds, which is an hour. So now we have our access and refresh tokens. So this is all about tokens. Now performing CRUD operations over it. So what do you do with this token? Your ultimate aim is to access data in Zoho CRM. So what you have to do is you ultimately want to perform some operation in one of the modules or on the records. So the different CRUD operations that you can perform on a record are create, read, update, and delete. So let's just try out an API call with the tokens we just generated. So before making an API call, we need to know that in Zoho CRM, we see all these modules. We see leads, contacts, accounts, deals, etc. And these are called display labels. And this display label could be renamed. It could look different when they're translated. And It could be, because I said it could be renamed, it could look different to each user. So when you're making API calls, you need to make, you need to hit a specific endpoint that doesn't change. That is why we use something called API names. So because API names are, non-editable for system generated fields, it is, easier to make API calls. So where do you find API names? So you can go to setup, developer hub, APIs and SDKs, and here you can see the API names tab. So here we have different modules. When you click one of them, you can see the different fields that are there, the data type of each of these fields, and then the API name. So here I'm able to see edit here because these are all custom fields. This company field is a system defined field in each module. So this API name is not editable. So because something is not editable, it is permanent, it is easier for us to make API calls. That is why we have introduced API names. So whenever you are making API calls, we will always have API names in terms of the keys. So now we know we have, all these fields, and we have, we know the different field types, and we have the API names. What happens when you don't have a UI? In self-client, your application is simply going to perform, a backend job. So you don't have a UI. So how do you find out the API name? So this is where we have the metadata APIs. So when you want to make, let's say I want to try to create a lead in the leads module. So for that, I need to first know the API name of the leads module. So I'll make a modules metadata API call, which gives me the modules API name. Then in leads module, you can see you have, so many number of fields, and then let's just go to, yeah. So here in the leads module, you can see each record, has so many different fields. So how do I know the API name of each of these fields? How do I know the data type of each of these fields? So here you make a fields metadata API call, which lists the, API names of the fields, the data type, if it's a pick list, what are the different values of the pick list. And then when you have all the information, now you have all the key names, you have all the API names. So then you make a insert records API call. Now let's just try it out with the tokens we've just generated. So I'm using the V6 API. So if you have our Postman collection, it is going to be really easy for you because it's all already in place. So when I want to, I want to create a lead. So I need to make an API call to the leads module. So for this, I need to know the API name of the leads module first. So what I do is I make a metadata API call to the module first. So when I make a metadata API call, this is the endpoint. So here you can see the API domain is www.zohoaps.com because that is what I received while generating the access token. If your user is in some other domain, this could be different. So I'm making an API call to CRM's V6 API. I'm accessing settings because that is where, metadata APIs are. And then I'm accessing metadata of the modules. So under authorization, you can see I have given my bearer token, which is nothing but the access token, which I generated recently. Now I'm making an API because I'm fetching. This is going to be a GET request. So I am making this API call. As you can see, I have all the modules listed here. So I need to, find the API name of the leads module. So how do I do that? I know the display label. So the display label is going to be leads because that's what I see in the UI. So I simply search for leads here. So I get the plural label, the actual plural label, and then I get the API name. So the API name is going to be leads. So now I have the API name of my module. Now I want to know the different fields that are there in this module. So what I do is I make a field metadata API call. So this is the, again, API domain. I'm accessing CRM's V6 APIs under settings. So I'm accessing the field metadata API. This takes the parameter module. So module here, I have to give the modules API name because I want to insert a record in the leads module. My modules API name is going to be leads. So again, this is going to be a get call. And then as you can see under authorization, I have given my bearer token and my access token. So when I hit send, I get a list, I get a response, which, has all the fields in the leads module. So let's say I just, I don't have to create a lead by giving it input to all the fields that are there in the module. So let's just say I want to enter leads last name. So I'm just looking for last name. So when I search for last name, this is my field label. This is the display label. And then I'll have the API name. So I just have to look for the API name of last name field. For the API name. Yeah, API name, last name. So the API name for the last name field is last underscore name. So now I know the API name of my last name field, and then system mandatory. In a module, many fields can be made mandatory. So if it is mandatory, this key will tell you if it is a mandatory key. So mandatory true indicates this is a mandatory key and has to be included in the input. Now, what is the type of field? So this JSON type gives you, because APIs only accept JSON as input and render a JSON output. Your input will also be a JSON. So the JSON type is going to be a string, which means the last name field is essentially a single line field in the UI, and in JSON terms, it is a string. Similarly, I want to look for, I want to enter the company details. So I'm just looking for company, field label company, display label is company, and the API name will be again company. So I have here, and is this system mandatory? No, it is not a system mandatory field. And then the JSON type is again a string. So let's just look for lead status. Lead status is the field label here. This is the display label. And then when I look for API name, it is lead underscore status. So this is a pick list. So the pick list values are attempted to contact, contact in future, contacted, junk lead, etc. So these are the values for this pick list field. So let's just try and insert a record in the leads module with this data. So I'm trying to insert a record here. So here I have the company, I have the last name, and I'm trying to insert the lead status. S is capital. So lead status is contacted. So as you can see, I'm giving this in the input body, and again in authorization, I have my bearer token, which is the access token. Because I'm inserting a record into a CRM, this is going to be a post request. So just make sure your JSON is clean. So once that is done, hit send. I have a response here. So 201 created. This is a typical HTTP status code. 201 means the record is created. So in the response, you can see it is a success. Under details key, you can see the modified time, modified by, the created time, and ID. This ID is the record ID. This is what identifies the record in Zoho CRM. And then again, it gives created by, approval state, message, and status. So now I've created this lead. Let me just try and get this lead. So again, I'll be using records, get records API. I'll make an API call to the leads module, and then I have to give my record ID here. So when I give my record ID and I'm fetching, so this is going to be a get. Again, I have authorized my API call by giving the access token. When I hit send, I have the record here. So let's just look for the last name, last underscore name. This is the name I gave. Let's look at the lead status, contacted, and I also inputted company. So company is Silka. So now I have created a record using records API. So let's just see in the UI if this record is created. Yeah. So this record is created, last name, lead name, company, and then you can get the created by date, created by this user on this date and time. So there we have it. This is how you make API calls.